There are moments in music history that everyone remembers. The first chord of a legendary song, the final bow of an icon, the encore that became eternal. But there are other moments, quieter ones, that almost no one talks about. Moments that happened in half-empty venues on forgotten nights in front of crowds who didn't understand what they were witnessing. This is the story of one of those nights. The night Jim Morrison stood on stage for 7 minutes and said nothing. The night the music stopped and the truth finally broke through. January 1970. A small theater in Boston. Brick walls, low ceilings, cigarette smoke hanging in the air like ghosts. The venue held maybe 400 people, and tonight it was 3/4 full. Not a stadium. Not a legendary concert hall. Just a room where people came to hear music and forget their lives for a while. The Doors were scheduled to play. Ray Manzarek on keyboards, Robbie Krieger on guitar, John Densmore on drums, and Jim Morrison on vocals. Except Jim Morrison wasn't sure he remembered how to be Jim Morrison anymore. Backstage, the air was thick with tension. Ray paced back and forth, his fingers tapping an invisible keyboard against his leg. Robbie sat on a worn couch, tuning his guitar for the 3rd time, though it didn't need tuning. John leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Jim. And Jim sat in the corner, staring at nothing. Or maybe at everything. His leather pants, his shirt half unbuttoned, his hair falling across his face. He looked like the Jim Morrison the world expected. But inside, something had shifted. Something had broken. Or maybe, for the first time in years, something had finally healed. The band had been on the road for weeks. City after city, stage after stage, the same songs, the same screams, the same expectations. Light my fire. Break on through. The end. Night after night, Jim delivered. He performed. He commanded. He became the shaman, the poet, the dark prophet that everyone wanted him to be. But lately, something felt wrong. The applause felt hollow. The songs felt rehearsed. And Jim felt like he was wearing someone else's skin. He had started writing again, late at night in hotel rooms, words spilling onto paper that no one would ever see. Words that were his, not the Doors, not the audiences, not the industries. Just his. And in those words, he was searching for something he'd lost, himself. Ray finally stopped pacing and turned to Jim. You ready? Jim looked up slowly. His eyes were clear, but distant. I don't know. Ray frowned. What do you mean you don't know? We're on in 5 minutes. Jim stood up, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. I mean, I don't know if I can do this tonight. Robbie looked up from his guitar. Do what? Sing? Jim, we've got a packed house out there. They're waiting for you. Jim shook his head. They're not waiting for me. They're waiting for him. The guy on the album covers, the guy in the interviews. The myth. John spoke for the first time, his voice calm. Then give them the myth. That's what we do. Jim turned to him, and for a moment, something like sadness crossed his face. But what if I'm tired of pretending? The silence that followed was heavy. The band had heard Jim talk like this before, late at night after too many drinks when the walls came down and the poet emerged from beneath the performer. But never right before a show. Never minutes before they were supposed to walk onto a stage. Ray stepped closer. Jim, listen, I get it. This life, it's heavy. It's exhausting. But we have a job to do. People paid to see us. We owe them a show. Jim looked at Ray for a long moment. Do we? Or do we owe them the truth? Before anyone could answer, the stage manager knocked on the door. 5 minutes, guys. The walk from the dressing room to the stage felt longer than usual. Jim moved slowly, as if walking through water. The sounds of the venue filtered through the walls. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses, the restless energy of a crowd waiting for something to happen. The band took their positions. Ray at his keyboard, Robbie with his guitar, John behind his drums, and Jim walked to the microphone, alone. The lights came up. The crowd erupted. Screams, applause, bodies pressing forward. 400 people who had come to witness rock and roll history. To see the Doors. To see Jim Morrison. The icon. The legend. The myth. But Jim just stood there. He didn't grab the microphone. He didn't address the crowd. He didn't move. He simply stood, his hand resting lightly on the mic stand, his face illuminated by the harsh stage lights. 10 seconds passed. 20. 30. The crowd's energy began to shift. Confusion rippled through the masses like wind through wheat. Someone shouted, "Come on, Morrison! Sing something." But Jim didn't react. He just stood there, staring out into the sea of faces he couldn't fully see past the blinding lights. But he could feel them. He could sense their energy, their expectations, their hunger for the performance they'd been promised. Ray glanced at Robbie. Robbie looked at John. John watched Jim, concern etched across his face. This wasn't part of the show. This wasn't planned. This was something else entirely. 1 minute passed. The murmuring grew louder. People began to shift uncomfortably. Was he drunk? Was he high? Was he having some kind of breakdown? What was happening? This wasn't how rock stars behaved. This wasn't the script anyone expected. Backstage, the manager was watching on a small monitor, his face growing redder by the second. What the hell is he doing? He hissed to no one in particular. Get him off that stage. Get him moving. Do something. But no one moved. Because somehow, everyone in that building knew that whatever was happening, it was important. It was real. And interrupting it would be like interrupting a prayer. 2 minutes. Jim closed his eyes. He took a deep breath that seemed to pull all the air from the room. And in that moment, something shifted. The crowd's anger began to fade, replaced by something else. Curiosity. Fascination. Fear. Because they were witnessing something they'd never seen before. Not a performance. Not entertainment. But a human being standing on the edge of something, deciding whether to jump or walk away. 3 minutes. Jim opened his eyes. He still didn't speak. But his hand tightened slightly on the microphone stand as if it was the only thing anchoring him to this reality. The silence was deafening. No music. No music. Just breathing. Just being. And for the first time in years, Jim Morrison wasn't performing. He was simply present. 4 minutes. Someone in the crowd yelled, "This is bullshit. We paid for a show." Others began to boo. But there were also people who stood completely still, mesmerized. Because they understood, even if they couldn't articulate it, that they were witnessing something profound. Something true. The death of a persona. The birth of something else. 5 minutes. Ray made a decision. He started playing. Soft, gentle notes on the keyboard, something improvised, something that felt like a question. Are you okay? Are you with us? Can you find your way back? But Jim didn't respond. He just stood there and the music floated around him like smoke. 6 minutes. Jim finally moved. He stepped closer to the microphone. The crowd leaned forward. This was it. He was going to sing. He was going to perform. He was going to give them what they came for. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back. Away from the microphone. Away from the expectation. Away from the myth. 7 minutes. And then, finally, Jim spoke. But not into the microphone. He turned to Ray, to Robbie, to John, and he said, just loud enough for them to hear over the confused murmur of the crowd, "I forgot how to pretend." Then he walked off the stage. No wave. No explanation. No apology. Just gone. The lights stayed on. The band sat frozen. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some people screamed in anger. Others sat in stunned silence. And a few, just a few, understood. Backstage, Jim walked straight past the manager, past the assistants, past everyone trying to ask him what the hell just happened. He walked into the dressing room and sat down in the same corner he'd been sitting in before the show. And for the first time in months, maybe years, his face looked peaceful. Ray burst in first. "Jim, what the hell was that?" Jim looked up at him. That was the truth. Robbie followed. "The truth? Jim, we have a contract. We have obligations. You can't just walk off stage." Jim's voice was quiet but firm. "I just did." John entered last, closing the door behind him. He sat down across from Jim, the only one not yelling, not demanding, not confused. "Talk to us," he said simply. Jim took a breath. "I can't do this anymore." "Do what?" "Pretend. Perform. Be the guy everyone wants me to be, the shaman. The poet king. The dark prophet. That's not who I am. I don't even know if that was ever who I was. Maybe it was just a character I created because it was easier than being myself." Ray sat down, his anger deflating into concern. "So who are you?" Jim smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I don't know, that's the problem. I've been Jim Morrison the performer for so long that I forgot how to be Jim. Just Jim. The guy who writes poems. The guy who wants to make films. The guy who's scared and confused and doesn't have all the answers." Robbie shook his head. "So what do we do now? We have shows scheduled. We have an album to finish. We have people depending on us." Jim looked at each of them. "I know. And I'm sorry. I'm not saying I'm quitting. I'm not saying the doors are over. I'm just saying I can't keep doing this the same way. I can't keep pretending that the performance is enough. That the applause fills the emptiness. That success means I'm okay." There was a long silence. Then John spoke. "So what do you need?" Jim looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in the question. "I need to remember why I started making music in the first place. Not for fame, not for money, not for the myth, but because I had something to say, something real. And somewhere along the way, I stopped saying it. I started saying what people wanted to hear. Ray nodded slowly. So we start over. What? We start over. We go back to the beginning. We remember why we became the Doors. Not to be rock stars, but to make music that mattered. Music that was true. Jim's eyes filled with something that looked like hope. You'd do that. Ray smiled. Jim, we didn't follow you because you were a myth. We followed you because you were real. The guy who wrote poetry on napkins. The guy who talked about breaking through to the other side. The guy who believed music could change the world. That's the Jim Morrison we want to make music with. Outside the dressing room, the manager was furious. The promoter was threatening to sue. The crowd was demanding refunds. But inside that room, something else was happening. 4 men who had built a legend were deciding to tear it down and build something real instead. It wouldn't be easy. The industry would fight them. The fans would be confused. The critics would call it artistic suicide. But for the first time in a long time, Jim Morrison felt like himself. The next morning, the reviews were brutal. Morrison melts down on stage. Doors concert ends in disaster. Is Jim Morrison losing his mind? But buried in one small publication, a music journalist who had been at the show wrote something different. Last night, I witnessed something I never expected to see. I saw a rock star stop performing and start being human. I saw Jim Morrison choose truth over spectacle. And while the crowd may have been angry, I left that venue feeling like I'd witnessed something sacred. The death of a myth. The birth of honesty. Jim read that review in a hotel room alone, and he smiled. Not the smile of the performer, but the smile of someone who had finally, after years of wearing masks, taken off the last one. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be more bad reviews, more angry crowds, more people who wanted the old Jim Morrison back. But there would also be something else. Music that came from a real place. Words that meant something. Performances that weren't performances at all, but conversations. Truths. Moments of genuine connection. Years later, people would still talk about that night in Boston. Some would call it the beginning of the end for the Doors. Others would call it the moment Jim Morrison lost his mind. But a few, just a few, understood what really happened. That night, Jim Morrison didn't lose anything. He found something. Himself. And that was worth more than all the applause in the world. The legacy of that night lives on in the music that came after. In the poems Jim wrote in the months that followed. In the honesty that seeped back into the songs. In the way the Doors began to perform not for the crowd, but for themselves. Not as myths, but as humans. And in the quiet moments when the stage lights were off and the crowds were gone, Jim Morrison would remember that night. The night he stood silent for 7 minutes. The night the music stopped. The night he chose truth over performance. And he would smile. Because that was the night he stopped being a legend and started being real. If this story moves you, if it reminds you that honesty is more powerful than performance, that truth matters more than applause, that being yourself is braver than being what others expect, then remember Jim Morrison not as the myth, but as the man. The poet who forgot how to pretend. The performer who chose silence over spectacle. The human being who, for 7 minutes on a cold January night, stood on a stage and decided that being real was more important than being a rock star. And in that decision, he became something far greater than any myth could ever be. He became himself.